What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burtonette. And in today's episode, I'm going to be bringing you the latest in my series of the top 5 games in each of the Power 4 conferences ahead of the 2024 seasons, as those have kind of come out in the recent weeks. And in today's episode, you've seen it in the title, we're going to be taking a look at the Big Ten. But before I get into looking over the top 5 games in the expanded Big Ten this year, if you're going to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I post. But without further ado, let's dive into the games. And if you've noticed, kind of the theme in this series has been starting out with the firsts. Thankfully, the Big Ten's a bit more clear with this. The last video I made, I think on the Big 12, there were a couple of games that were technically non-conference that I talked about, but regardless, we're going to be going over the first here. There are 4 new teams in the Big Ten this year, all coming over from the Pac-12, and those teams are Oregon, USC, UCLA, and Washington. And starting out those games, the first in the Big Ten overall and for these new teams is UCLA at Indiana. It's not exactly a loaded matchup. Chip Kelly's Bruins should be able to get the job done. Then the following week, we get a big one, and one team has to wait, but we'll get to them in a second. The first game isn't quite the big one. It's Northwestern at Washington, but Northwestern took some serious strides forward this year in spite of the scandal surrounding the program this year, and under David Braun had a phenomenal season. So I think this is a case where the Wildcats could, make a statement against a Washington Huskies team that is expected by many to take a step back from being the national championship runner-up, a finalist in college football. But I think this is actually I think it's kind of an under-the-radar game, too. I think this one is maybe going to be a better game than the one that more of the eyeballs will be fixed on. And that game that will draw, I'm sure, bigger ratings overall, depending on where these games are broadcast, is USC at Michigan. You have the Trojans, who really had a disappointing season with the expected number 1 overall draft pick and the last year's Heisman Trophy winner, Caleb Williams at quarterback. Really a disappointing season. Obviously, a lot of holes on the defensive end from Alex Grinch's USC defensive unit, and they're going up against the Michigan team that kind of like Washington, both of the finalists, the champion, the Wolverines, and Washington, are going to be expected by many to take a step back. I don't think either team drops completely off the map. I think Washington's a little more likely to be really fighting for a playoff berth in the 12-team field. I think Michigan is a lot more likely to solidify their place. But this matchup at the Big House, you have the history of USC going up against the history of Michigan. It is a prime matchup. I hope this game is, at the very least, late afternoon slot. Even better would be if this is the night game. The Maze Out at the Big House would be big for this game. So that's the one to look at. And then the next game for USC is going to be kind of another challenge. It's a very, very solid welcome to the Big Ten for the Trojans. They have at Michigan, and then the next week they host Wisconsin. So a pretty tough slate for the Trojans there to start Big Ten play. And then for the final team of these new teams is the Oregon Ducks. Their first Big Ten game. This one is, I looked it over, this is from the Big Ten schedule, not just the team schedule, will be at UCLA on September 28th. UCLA then goes at Penn State, so definitely a little bit of a tough open to Big Ten play for UCLA. You have at Indiana, then home against Oregon, then at Penn State. And then for Oregon, their first game against a Big Ten team is a team that they've played regularly. I think recently they've had a couple of series against them, I think, or maybe it's been a little while since they did. That was the mid-2010s. They'll be hosting Michigan State. So those are the firsts for every team. So those are kind of my 5 spot. In the number 4 spot, we have the national championship rematch. I think if both coaches would have stayed, this probably would have been number 2 in this list. Number 1 is going to be obvious, and I probably won't spend too much time on number 1 because I think everybody kind of expects what that one's going to be. I'll probably talk more about these other games. But it's a national championship rematch on October 5th. It's going to be Michigan at Washington. So the Wolverines will travel out to Seattle. I'm pretty sure that's their first long road trip outside of traditional Big Ten territory. And so the question for both teams is going to be answering, are they taking a step back? The winner of this game will be in a prime position to not only be in that 12-team field, I think even the loser will not be knocked out of that conversation, but I think the winner of this game will position themselves to be the favorite in the Big Ten potentially, and there's other games to talk about too. And after this, both teams have a tough slate. So this is a very important game because Michigan, some of their other games, really the ones that I think are games that they have a chance to lose in, or at least high-profile games. They host USC and Oregon, and they go to Ohio State. So these 4 games, including this game against Washington, at worst, they need to split those, and they need to go perfect in the other 8 games. I think they're probably likely to win 3 out of 4. When we get closer to the season, look over rosters and stuff like that in preview, I'll give more of an answer in predicting how I think they'll do. But these 4 games are important, and I think this could be the best one that Michigan has, aside from obviously the game against Ohio State that I'll talk about a little bit more later. For Washington, after this game, they're home against USC, and then they have road games, and these are throughout the schedule, not in this order necessarily, at Iowa, at Penn State, and at Oregon. That's a really tough slate for the Huskies. I think losing all the players they did from last year, losing Kalen DeBoer, head coach, to Alabama. Jed Fish, I think, is going to step in and do a very good job. He did a phenomenal job at Arizona over the last several years. But it is a really tough slate for Washington. If they're able to get a big home win over the Wolverines, I think that puts them in a good position, again, to not only have a chance at making the 12-team field. They'll still have that chance if they lose. But I think it puts them in a spot where they could be considered a serious contender to win the Big Ten, because there's a couple teams that I think are probably the favorites for winning the Big Ten this year. And Michigan is still there, but I think they're just behind 2 teams because of the offseason that 2 teams are having. One other game before I get into the big one, Washington at Penn State on November 9th. And here's why I think this game is big. First of all, I think these 2 teams will probably match up pretty well, and I think it could make for an exciting game. And number 2, I think both of these teams are going to be on kind of that fringe playoff range, right in that 9 to 15 ranking by the time this matchup comes around. And then after that, both teams, they'll have some tough games. But for Penn State, they don't face Michigan this year, and they do face Ohio State. So for Penn State, they have at USC and at Wisconsin before hosting. Yeah, they host the Buckeyes in the weeks leading up to this game. And Washington, meanwhile, they play at Oregon in the season finale. So both of these teams, I think this is the game that'll be circled on their calendar. They have those tough tests that they're obviously going to be building up for, but I think this is a game, especially because it's later in the season, that the winner of this game, I think this game really actually could be effectively a college football playoff play-in game. I think it's certainly possible that both teams make it, because the Big Ten is such high quality now with the teams that are coming in. You could see a 3-loss team get in, but I think more likely it's going to be 2. And I think both of these 2 teams might have 2 losses when they arrive at this game. But that's kind of my thoughts on the 3rd best game in the Big Ten this season. Coming in at number 2, this is kind of a 2-part answer here, two games for this spot, and that's Oregon's big games this year. I think second would be their game at Michigan November 2nd, but I think even bigger will be the showdown in Eugene on October 12th against the Ohio State Buckeyes. I think because of the off seasons that they've had, the production that they have coming back or coming in for both teams in the case of this matchup, Ohio State and Oregon is really probably the matchup to kind of, at least at the midway point of the season, showcase who is the best team in the Big Ten. Right now, Michigan is still the national champions, and I think we cannot overlook the Wolverines as college football fans. I think they're going to be making noise. I think they're going to do phenomenally under Sharon Moore, and they're certainly not going away. I think this matchup, though, is the one that kind of sets the tone. The winner of this game will be in a position to claim that, potentially number 1 or number 2 overall ranking when the college football playoff rolls around, but certainly that bye as a conference champion and the highest ranked team. So this is a huge game. I think it's also a question for Oregon early on how they'll do against the Big Ten's best, and that's both of these matchups, the one at home against Ohio State and at Michigan. That's a question they'll have to answer. And then their finish to the season is also tough. So if they drop both of these games, they then have 2 tough games to end the season. They're at Wisconsin, then they get a bye, and then they host Washington to close the regular season. So for Oregon, if they can beat the Buckeyes at home, and I would not call that an upset, I think Oregon and Ohio State are very interchangeable as to who's the favorites coming into the 2024 season in the Big Ten. So I think that game will be huge. And I think if the Ducks can win that, they can probably afford to lose to Michigan. I think it's a case of probably, obviously, they have the expectation. They have the program to go out and try to win all 4. But I think really, realistically, if they're able to obviously win 3 out of 4 and even split, I think they're still in a good position. So you win that first of these big 4 games against Ohio State, then you're really setting yourself up in a good position if you're Oregon. And so finally, again, I'm going to keep this one a little bit brief because it's the game that's probably the game in college football that's talked about the most. It's called the game for a reason. That's Ohio State, Michigan. The Buckeyes will host the Wolverines on November 30th to close the regular season. I'm sure, as always, it'll be noon on Fox. And so it's a big game. And the question this year is, where will the Wolverines be when this game rolls around? Will they be undefeated again? Or will they have a loss on their resume? Same question for Ohio State. Again, just because they're favored because of the big offseason, they still got to go out there and win the games on the field. So this game probably won't have a lot at stake for the college football playoff, but it will still for the rivalry and will probably decide who goes to the Big Ten championship out of these 2 teams. Of course, it is possible, if they're both undefeated in conference play, that they would just face off again the next week because there's no divisions. But those are my top 5 games in the Big Ten this coming season. I think some teams, like Iowa, they're on the schedule, or even in Minnesota, I think this is Penn State. I'll have to check. They finish at Purdue and at Minnesota after the game against Washington. So a lot to look forward to in the Big Ten this year. I'm really excited for the 4 teams that are coming in. I didn't talk a whole lot about UCLA, but they're no slouch. They lose quarterback Dante Moore to Oregon, so that'll be something that they'll have to figure out a replacement for him. But let me know the games that you're most looking forward to in Big Ten play. Let me know which one you think will have the highest stakes. And maybe comment below your thoughts on who will be the Big Ten champion this year, and maybe who the other teams will be that make the college football playoff as it expands to 12 teams. But that's it for this episode of College Football Talk with Peter Burtnett. I'm your host, and have a great rest of your day. Signing out. Peace.